So basic block, you put something inside of a box, you select it and drag it over to the swatches and it makes a new swatch. Let's say you want to do something a little more complex. Maybe I still want to do a polka dot, but I want to have it with more dots per block. So instead of one dot in each block, I want to have, let's say, 5. So to do that, I'm still going to use this circle as my general unit for the dot. Each corner of my square. And the smart guides really help with this because it tells me where the center point can line up with each corner. So I've got a dot in each corner. What I'm going to do now is use the Pathfinder, or actually I could use the Shape Builder tool to cut out the pieces of this circle. So let me bring this box in front. So I'm going to roll over each circle and basically cut out the part that overlaps with the corner of the square. And those turned white because my square was white. I'm going to go back and select those. And just so you guys need these other pieces of the circle, so I can just delete that. So now I'm going to select everything and hopefully drag it over here and make a new swatch. I don't know why it's so finicky this morning. I'm sorry guys, I don't know why this isn't working the way it should. I'll use the star one as an example because I've already got this done. The star here, same deal. I took the star, I moved it so that the center of each star was lined up with the corner of the box. So then when I dragged it over here to make a swatch, it gets repeated and basically the pieces get put together so that I get more stars. This makes it a little bit less evident that I'm using the block repeat. So especially if you want the look of a more complex pattern, or let's say you want some of the stars to be a little bit of a different color, you could do this and have it repeat in a little bit more of a complex way. All right. So the other more basic type of repeat pattern would be the stripe. And to do that, let's say I've made my one stroke to the size of the box, so it's 2 inches high. I'm going to click and drag it and use Command D to duplicate it so it's in equal increments from one another, and take it all the way across. And if I really wanted to be accurate about it, I would also measure to make sure that the increments are at a 1/16 of an inch all the way across. So when it gets repeated, it's a 1/16 of an inch, each stripe is a 1/16 of an inch away from one another. So once again, I'm going to take a 2x2 white box. I'll put that behind to set the boundaries for the pattern. Bless you. And then drag it over to make a new swatch. And that time it did it with no problem, so I don't. So then it creates a nice stripe pattern. Of course, there's this gap here because I don't really care so much right now for the purpose of demonstration whether everything is perfectly separated from one another. I can make that so that all of the lines are equally apart. I could also take all of these lines and rotate them to get a grid. And then that would be repeated. And I guess another thing you could do if you really just want a grid pattern is you could go over to the grid tool, put in specific measurements. So I want it 2x2, and I could have 15 and 15. And it would create a grid for me. So then that could be its own pattern. A plaid pattern. Maybe you want to have the hipster look, so you go in and vary the weight of the lines, make them different colors. Produce the same sort of thing. Pretty much all that matters is whatever is lined up on the left side needs to line up on the right side, same with top and bottom. If I have a pattern, let's say I go over here and I draw some diagonal lines, and I want to use this as my pattern. If I just take this and put it over as a new swatch, if it'll let me do it. Oh, this is so annoying. All right, we'll do it this way. If I were to take this and just repeat it manually, I put that block right next to another one, those lines are not going to line up, so it's not going to be a seamless pattern. If that's what you want and you just want a block on its own and you don't care about lines matching up or anything like that, you can totally do that. But if you do want it to match up, you're going to have to draw out your blocks and see how each block touches one another. So let's say I do want these lines to connect, then maybe I use the average option to bring lines together. And start to create more of a seamless. I have to take this over to the other side. And just move things around until I get the lines to connect the way I want them to. All right, so things like the diamond and the OG, like I said, are a bit more complex. So the easiest way to go about it is to actually start off with, let's say, a diamond shape. And use that as the template for where your items are going to go. So let's say this time I have my circle, but I'm going to have it go to the corners, but just turned a little bit differently. So it looks like a baseball diamond. I'm going to go in, use the shape builder tool to cut out the outer parts of the circles. So now I'm left with this repeat pattern. In order to make it work with the block, I would have to take this, bring it in here, and figure out how it's going to get repeated. This is definitely something you could do, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's really hard. So I'd have to go through and take these. I'm going to group them just for my sanity. And see how they get lined up. And from here, I'd have to figure out how these repeats could get put inside of a box for me to use for a block repeat. So in this instance, I could take the box and have one dot here in the center. There's going to be half of a sphere on either side and then a quarter of a sphere. So I could go back and use my shape builder tool to cut out these shapes once more. I'm going to ungroup these. Now I'm going to take all of these little sections of these circles and just make them the right color. Alright, and I would have some cleaning up to do because as you can see if I zoom in, there's some parts where there's lines showing and everything. I have to go in and I would pretty much just go over and redraw the circles. But I could take that and try to make a new swatch. And so there I get that pattern. Obviously, you do a more complex pattern than this because there's a lot of ways to make this exact same pattern. But that's the method you would use to reproduce the diamond if you wanted to put it into a block to have Illustrator reproduce it. The other way you could do it is do it yourself. And for this, I'm going to go ahead and start with my full artboard. So I'm going to go ahead and make a tabloid size artboard. I'm going to go back and make a diamond. And I'll take this heart that I made before. And I'll put this in the center. And I'm also, just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to make the box a different color. And I'll change the outline too. Move this down a little bit. So for the diamond pattern, I'm going to have it repeat horizontally. And then for the next row, I'm going to flip it, just to have some variation. And so all I'm doing here is using Command D to duplicate really fast. And then using the smart guides, it helps me figure out where things are lining up. And if I were doing this for anything other than a demonstration, I would actually be super precise, but I'm not going to inflict my perfectionism on you guys right now. So I bring the pattern down to where I want it to repeat and just do Command D to duplicate it in equal increments. So right there I get my repeat pattern. And from here I can scale it down and get it exactly where I need it to be. And of course, since my heart has different effects on it, it's going through and adjusting it. So I'm just going to tell it to stop. So that's the diamond. If I wanted to do more of an OG pattern, I could either create my own OG, or since the hexagon is pretty much the same thing, I could just make a 6-sided shape. And I could make that repeat in the same way. Actually, for this one, if I want it more like the OG, I'd have the sides touching. So I'm first going to make sure that I create some shapes where all the sides are touching. So with these 3, then I can go and duplicate those to get more of the honeycomb shape. So by doing it this way, I get more control over where I'm putting each individual. Downsides is if I have something with a lot of effects and everything on it, it's going to slow down the computer. One thing you could do if you've got a lot of effects is you can go in and rasterize your shapes. Keep in mind, rasterize means turning into pixels. So if you go and rasterize something, it's going to make little pixels of it, and if you try to go back and make it bigger again, it's going to be pixelated. So you probably don't want to rasterize anything unless you know you're not going to scale it anymore. But let's say I know the heart is where I want it to be and I don't want to edit it anymore. I can go to Effects, Rasterize. It brings up this option. I wanted it 300 dpi. So I click that and it takes this vector shape and makes it into a raster image. But if I were, you can see on all the outer edges here, it's all pixelated and gross. So it'll make the process a little repeating the patterns and things, but it diminishes the quality of the vector. So if I'm doing a repeat pattern for the back of the cards, more than likely, since these need to be functional cards, the pattern is probably going to have to be kind of small. But pretty much I'm just going to fill up the whole back of the card this way, or the other sheet of paper. So I would just go through and fill up the whole back of this tabloid sheet of paper. So then when I do the duplex, it's just going to put that pattern back there. And when I trim it, I'm going to trim it using the guides on the front of where my face cards have been printed. And so I don't have to worry about whether or not everything's centered. It's just this big repeat pattern. Are there any questions about making patterns? Hopefully your all's version of Illustrator isn't as messed up as mine is right now, and you can actually make splotches pretty easily. All right, so another option you guys have is to use texture for your backgrounds for that, or even if you want to do like a background for your cards and you'd rather not print on a different type of paper, you would do the same sort of thing as you would with the pattern. Make an artboard to the full size of a tabloid sheet of paper. Then make a rectangle in one color. You could copy, make a new color on top of it, and maybe add some effects. So probably the easiest one to deal with is changing the gradient a little bit. So you could do this and then maybe do some kind of texture work to it. And so you get a really subtle texture. Especially if you're going to use the texture for the background for your cards, you probably want it to be more subtle because you need the design that's in the center of your card to take the central focus. But same thing, you want it to be printed on the entire back of the card. Now to set up your cards to be printed, I'm going to go back and still do a tabloid sized artboard. And I'm going to make a bunch of rectangles to the size of my cards. Which is 2.5 by 3.5. And if I'm not going to really have any type of bleed on this, then all I need to do is line everything up. So I'm going to go in and duplicate all of these and just try to fit as many on here as I can. Now if you use the cardstock, just the white cardstock that's in the paper closet, I think we only have letter size, so you'll need to work with the letter size artboard. But if you want to use some of the specialty paper like the French speckle tone or something like that, I think those are all in larger sheets, so you could use the tabloid size template. But you just line them up like this so they're all touching one another. But in order to make sure that you trim things out really nicely without having any crop marks showing, what you'll need to do is actually create some crop marks. So what I'm going to do is actually just select these outer rectangles, and I'm going to go up to Object, and there's this option that says Create Trim Marks. And what that does is it goes in and it automatically puts in trim marks. And I guess I have to actually do these individually. I only need to have these trim marks on the outer edge of the whole set of cards. So as I'm doing this, I'm actually going to go back and delete some of the crop marks because I don't want them to show up in my final printing. So I'm actually going to go and take I'm going to select all of these I'm going to go inside of these groups and delete any trim marks that show up on the inner part of the card groups because I don't need them. So just to show you guys what I'm doing, I'm going to take the stroke off of those cards. Actually, I'll put a white on them. Let's see. So now I just have the crop marks on the outer section, and I just want to center this so that I get all the cards in the middle. I'm going to group all of these, and I'm going to go to Align to Artboard. Yeah, my program is all messed up because it's not even aligning to the right artboard. You would do Align to Artboard and it would actually center for you. So anytime you're doing this, especially if you have something on the back that is unique, that is in the center of each card, it's something that has to be the same on the back of each card, you would want to make sure that all the cards are centered on the artboard. So then when you send it to the printer, everything is where it's supposed to be. If you have these cards, say up in the corner like this, then when you go to print the backs aren't going to be centered. But when I'm ready to go and print this out, what I would suggest doing is taking note of the number of the artboard. It'll show up in this lower left corner here, as, and save it out as a PDF. And you only need to choose the artboards that you actually want to print. So I'm going to do 8 and 9. We'll pretend that the back of 8, that 8 is the back of my cards and 9 is the front. So when I save it as a PDF, I get this window that comes up. I would suggest going to High Quality Print. This automatically makes sure that everything is set to 300 DPI, so it's ready for printing. And right now we don't need the bleeds or crop marks or anything because we already have it on there. So when I get my PDF, I've got my background page and then I've got my card page. So when I go to print in there, I could select duplex as an option, and it would print the background on one side and then the cards on the other. So that's why it's important that everything is centered, because if it's not centered, things are going to be off. Just make sure that when you go to print that you don't have it shrink. You want to make sure there's no page scaling. Of course, you'd be using an actual paper size that matches the size of your document, but just make sure you don't change the page or this page scaling, because then it'll make your cards smaller than they're supposed to be. Now let's say you actually do have a bleed on your cards. If that's the case, then what I would suggest is creating a separate artboard for each card. So I'm going to make an artboard and make it 2.5 by 3.5. And I'm going to go back to my document setup, and I'm going to put in a bleed. So I'll make it 1/8 of an inch. This is not good. If my program were working properly, there would actually be a red box around each artboard that shows where the bleed gets extended to. For whatever reason, it's not showing up on here. But if you have a bleed, if you have part of your artwork extending all the way to the edges of each card, you'd need that bleed. So as you're working, you would just make sure that any part of your artwork that goes to the edge actually goes all the way to the bleed mark. And you can duplicate these artboards. So if you use the Artboard tool, you can do the same thing like you do with shapes. You hold down Option and Shift to duplicate and move along the same axis. And then put in as many artboards as you need. And so I would have a bleed and I would be able to see that. I believe you'd still have to manually put in crop marks. If you were to print out this whole larger artboard, it's not going to show the crop marks for each individual artboard, which really sucks. But you know how to make crop marks now. So you would just go in, take each one of these squares, or rectangles rather, and make crop marks like this. And really, once you just make one, you could just do Option or Command D and duplicate them all. Except they would actually line up. So that's how you would get it ready to print. Quickly, I want to show you guys the card box template. Actually, you know what? How about we take like a 10-minute break? I'm going to try to restart my Illustrator program and see if I can get it working, and then I'll show you guys the card box template, okay?